Welcome to the 2020 Idahobit panel. This panel is being co-hosted by the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Pride in Action Network. We're here today with three amazing speakers, and we also have our Associate Dean D&I from Architecture, Building and Planning, Associate Professor Anna Hurleman. So today we're going to be running through some information about COVID-19 in relation to Idahobit, which is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersexism and Transphobia. We're going to be learning a little bit about how some lives have changed over this time, the particularities of queer and trans people's lives in a time where we're isolated and perhaps searching for community. And I will, of course, acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge any elders past, present or emerging might be with us today, as well as to say that sovereignty has never been ceded. So we're going to be taking questions all the way through the seminar today. So feel free at any point to type in a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see us, just widen your screen as wide as you can. And you should be able to view us. If there's any tech issues or anything else you'd like to ask or something you can't see, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function. And happy to say hello to you too in there if you'd just like to say hi. Great, so I think one of the first questions I wanted to ask is, I wanted to welcome you all, of course. So we've got Sun Tzu Speechley, who is a PhD student in Architecture, Building and Planning. We've got Simona Castricum, another educator and PhD student in ABP. And we've got Oscar Gao, and Oscar is our recent graduate of the University of Melbourne, but also our outgoing student chair for the Pride in Action Network. So I'm really happy to see you all today. And I just wanted to ask, how have things changed for you during the COVID-19 pandemic? Maybe we'll start with Sun.
Well, I've definitely been doing a lot more baking. I think that's quite a common experience. I think for me, the impacts have been quite limited in some ways because I'm coming to the tail end of my PhD. So I was already doing quite a lot of work from home. So in that regard, the transition's been quite easy. But there's definitely been a, sort of, my world has shrunk in a lot of ways. I'm spending a lot of time at home and, the sort of social activities that I'd normally be engaging in have all sort of tapered off.
Simona?
Well, I too have learned a few recipes that I never knew before. Yeah, I'm pretty good at a lamb ragu at the moment, and my poached eggs have gotten a lot better. But yeah, maybe after this I could go into hospitality and cook or something like that, because it feels like being a queer academic and a musician at the moment is a bit grim, between the music industry shutting down the way that it has and for the foreseeable future as a performer. To have a lot of eggs, having one basket, and then also I guess as an academic, and then just I guess the news coming out of with the university and the unions this morning, and just the cuts that the education sector's facing. So yeah, I guess on those two things, like the future's looking a little bit grim, but that's actually really affecting me in sitting in isolation. I mean, I live alone, and sitting on the couch and mulling over those realities and those futures when things seemed a little bit different, perhaps about 2 or 3 months ago, has been a real strange thing to deal with. But also, like, the way that I cope as a queer person is to go to the club, is to head down to the 86 on a Thursday night or something like that, and just watch some drag and dance to some music, or wherever and see my chosen family. And that's just not an option at the moment. So, you know, I think people that live at different intersections, I guess, of queerness are experiencing that in different ways, regardless of how we've coped with isolation pre-COVID. Now I just think it's playing out in a really different way.
Well, for me, it's been an experience because I graduated in December. So you have all, you know, as sort of a fresh sort of bright-eyed graduate, you have all of these sort of plans that you kind of hope to fulfill in the near and sort of far future, but, you know, none of us sort of anticipated this. I was working until March, mid-March, until my contract expired. So I've also been thrown into this sort of world of job seeking that isn't very fun to navigate. And I mean, there's also other issues with housing and other stuff like that as an international, and sort of visa issues that sort of have sort of come and gone. But otherwise, it's been a challenge. I mean, I'm living alone right now. So I'm more suited to living alone, I guess. Previously, I did live with people, and that was sort of a bit chaotic. But yeah, it's a period defined by uncertainty. So you can't really plan for anything really. So that's sort of how it's been for me.
Thanks, everyone. So my next question is about families. So the notion of family has really been quite contentious during this time. And how do you feel about the way notions of family have been approached in the planning and implementation of social distancing measures?
Yeah, I think initially there was a lot of uncertainty around what it meant. I know particularly I don't live with my partner, and there was that one day in particular where there were very conflicting messages coming from the chief health officer, the premier, and the head of police. And I think what it highlighted is that our sort of legal system still very much conceptualizes family along heteronormative terms, and that, you know, we had to have a bit of pushback from the community for there to be some discretion used in terms of who you can see and can't see. And obviously now it's a lot easier with that ability to see up to 5 people. But yeah, in the early stages, I think, you know, there was a great deal of confusion around those policies. And in some ways, we didn't have it as bad as the UK. I know in the UK, there were a lot of discussions around people having to sort of move forward with moving in with partners, sort of move those sorts of plans ahead, or face not seeing them indefinitely. But over here, there was still a degree of uncertainty that I don't think was particularly helpful.
Simona?
Yeah, yeah, the definition of a partner or single partner, you know, like what about people that might have, you know, 2 or 3 or more partners, and, you know, what did that legislation during that time mean for them, and you know, for all of those people. So, and also like distance to travel as well. What did that mean for queer people who were in regional areas? What did that mean? You know, in my situation, it's just kind of like, you know, I've got a partner in the regions. I've also got a son, you know, on the outskirts of, you know, of Melbourne. So for me, it was just kind of like, wow, there's all this sort of traveling to do, and you know, and in between all of these different relationships, that, you know, it was just trying to get some clarity around the stay-at-home orders, but also just like, you know, sort of dodging the gauntlet of police if that needed be, and being a trans feminine person, you know, being a trans feminine person in any time of crisis, you know, as a non-conforming kind of body is a very strange way to pass through space, let alone in times like this. So, you know, for me in those first few weeks, that was a pretty frightening time. So, yeah, it just really affected my relationships that I was trying to maintain, but managed to get through. But yeah, definitely easier now soon.
Yeah, I can't I find it hard a bit for me to relate to this because I don't really have a concept of chosen family, and I've been living away from my biological family for some time now. But I can draw from sort of experiences that my friends have had because, you know, they were international students here and they were able to live a more sort of open life. But then they've had to sort of go back to whatever country they're from. And because, you know, it's in some countries, it's not very common to sort of live with friends or sort of have a share house or rent. So you're sort of forced into this situation where you're living with, you know, not just your nuclear family, but also your extended family. And it creates all sorts of sort of dynamics that you either don't want to be a part of or that you're just not used to because, you know, you haven't lived with, you know, this sixth cousin forever and then suddenly you have to live with them. And it sort of creates this, then you sort of have all these cultural different notions of family that exists sort of around the world. And, you know, you have stories of people in China who have their doors welded shut. And I couldn't imagine sort of living with my family like that because it's just, you have to navigate that space because then you have to navigate two different identities. And it's sort of just very suffocating for a lot of people as well, since you're not allowed to leave the house either, unless you know exercise or stuff like that. And it just doesn't really give you the space to sort of flex your sort of different identities.
Mm. Mm. Thank you, everyone. We have a question that's come in from the audience, actually, from Tonya, and it's for Simona. So Tonya is asking, as a performer as well, I'm finding it very difficult to motivate myself in the same way to perform online. Have you found the same? Or do you have any offers or openings to perform online or any ideas on how to remain active? And then a little follow-up that says, hi, Simona.
What was that? So
A
what
little
was the
follow-up saying, hi, Simona from Tonya.
Well, I feel like the queer musical community, generally the queer performance community, has really led the way in terms of how to organise online, and generally the music community. I think we've just had to. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be, I think, in the 4th or 5th Isolate, you know, festival that was happening on Instagram. I mean, that was amazing because it was like, I mean, it was so strange because it was like sort of 5 weeks after Golden Plains, and then, you know, then the next thing was like the only gig was to be able to do a live feed on the Instagram. So it was that was a huge change, but to see the fans like sort of interact with my audience through that way felt really good. And you know, but I've also been on radio. I did a fill on Triple R a couple of weeks ago. And then I did a DJ set for Bunker, you know, for a 36-hour party. And, you know, the responses were just like, it's really good to hear your voice. It's really like people are sort of stuck in their homes, and it was really nice to hear a familiar voice, you know, familiar queer voice to sort of come into that space. So I've been really grateful for those opportunities still to connect. But, you know, at the same time, I'm really conscious of people who have moved to Melbourne from the regions in January and December or halfway through last year, or wherever, who have sort of seen, okay, 2020 is the year where I'm going to make the dream happen. I'm going to, you know, I'm going to hit all the venues, and I'm going to drop an EP, and it's going to be great. And all of that energy is just sort of like really, you know, dissipated, and now it's trying to figure out what is the model of delivery for that. And you know, it's like Courtney Barnett did a show on Saturday night with, like, you know, Geryon and June Jones, you know, and so I feel like there's like really bigger musical identities are starting to sort of reach deeper into sort of grassroots queer communities and sort of lift everyone up. So but then also, like, there's huge parties that are being organised on Zoom as well. So, yeah, which is interesting what people do on camera, even in a private sense.
Well, this is I was curious, and I think my next question to the panel will be about space, being that is the, you know, theme of this particular panel, space and place. I was going to ask about the nighttime economy. for a lot of queer and trans folk, it's a really important part of belonging and connection. Queers have a long history of celebrating identity through club and music cultures. In what ways do you think COVID-19 has the potential to have lasting impacts on these spaces and scenes? And so I might ask Sun first.
Well, I think, you know, that the problem is in some ways broader than just the queer community. I mean, we see that a lot of pubs and music venues are struggling at the moment. I guess queer venues, though, being in some ways marginal and often a lot smaller, a lot more precarious financially, they're not in a position to reopen. And something we talked about previously, I think, you know, even with this easing of restrictions where licensed venues are able to open up to patrons with food, that by default sort of excludes a lot of queer nighttime venues which have, you know, no food provisions and, you know, they're probably going to be the last sorts of places that get to reopen. So I think, yeah, in some ways, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of the sort of decline in queer spaces generally. I mean, every year there seems to be more articles about how gay and lesbian venues are disappearing from, you know, X major city. And I think in some ways, COVID-19 is just going to exacerbate that because, you know, the financial pressures, you know, brought down to bear on these places is going to be too difficult for some to survive. But I mean, that's happening to places like the Tote as well, which, you know, are key parts of Melbourne's live music scene. So I think it's a bigger problem generally as well.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Oscar?
I've never really participated in sort of this nighttime sort of scene, so I'm gonna have to skip on this question.
Okay, and Simona?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's you know, the obvious stuff about nightclubs and clubs and those precincts, and it's just about how long they can ride them out for. You know, but I think, you know, there's a lot of, I guess, other nighttime economies that are affected within the queer community, like the sex industry has been seriously affected at the moment and is receiving absolutely no assistance from federal or state government, whether it be financially or politically. There's no will to speak about it from anybody, and it needs to be absolutely addressed. You know, I think things like sex shops and, you know, they've found a way to adapt and still found a way to provide a service and, you know, and to sort of like for their own survival and survival of their own, you know, clientele, and, you know, people are still at home and still want to have sex and all that kind of stuff. So, but just in terms of like sex work, I think that it's really important that policy, there needs to be a discussion about it full on because it's affecting queer people seriously.
Mm-hmm. We do have a question, another question from the audience. This is from Anna. The question is, what are the most fruitful online gathering spaces queers have found lately? Animal Crossing and Instagram seem popular, but commercial platforms are dishearteningly misaligned with queer politics at their core. What other spaces have been good for people to connect within?
I'm trying to think of the gaming platform.
Like Twitch or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so people were jumping off Zoom or people were touching off whatever, so they could do like live streams off sort of Twitch, I think, you know, but I think that question is sort of relating to like queer content on those as sort of like, it's sort of censored or taboo or whatever, or yeah, I get the feeling, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think we've all just been sort of, you know, pushing it until we get kicked off, you know, like, yeah, so.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same as you, that, you know, of course, these online platforms are not made for queer people, and like any other space, queer people just kind of go in and push boundaries until such time as, you know, obviously there's surveillance and sort of policing and stuff that happens in them, but we just push and push and push until we know the absolute limits of an app, and then we just migrate off. You know, like House Party is a good example
I guess, yeah, the issue with these things too is because they're commercial and, you know, by nature sort of corporate, the way they're policed and the way they're surveilled operates quite differently. I mean, in some ways it mirrors that kind of entrenchment and sort of encroachment into public space that's happening in the physical realm. But I think in the digital world, in some ways, there's more regulation in these big players, and queer people are having to find spaces online as well.
Mm.
Well, yeah, and I feel like there's more regulation in the sexual of a, you know, it's like queer organizing is always kind of seen as inherently sexual. So therefore it must be, you know, it's got to be surveilled, it's got to be policed, it's got to be shut down ASAP. Whereas like, you know, discussions about, you know, G5 towers being shut down and conspiracy theories about whatever, and hey, you know, Trump, you know, like, let's not shut that down because that's obviously not dangerous. But queers, like, you know, having a good time is like total threat to the state. So yeah, I mean, what changes in a virtual or you know, IRL, URL space has still got to push the boundaries, as you say, Megan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just having these discussions about policing and surveillance, I wanted to ask about the implementation and enforcement of policing and surveillance and how it's created particular issues for queer and trans folk. Would you like to explain how and why you think this might be the case? Oscar, would you like to go first?
I mean, generally, just looking at the sort of models that they use, it's a very sort of actuarial model where they try to sort of predict risk and manage risk instead of trying to abolish it entirely. As with the case of, you know, a disease where you kind of, you hear this discourse of, you know, it's going to be with us forever, that sort of thing. So people have acknowledged that it's going to be there. So instead of trying to solve it, it's kind of just trying to predict where, you know, a new outbreak will happen and sort of stuff like that. And that itself is fine, but if it's built on existing sort of inequalities and biases that exist in whatever society or system that it's built in, or whoever has developed it, it can sort of exacerbate the existing gaps that exist within whichever society that it's based in. And then this on top of a lot of the sort of xenophobia that's happening and a lot of the sort of very nationalistic discourse that's happening around the world, then you get a lot of sort of finger pointing and blaming. And, you know, you saw that with the sort of xenophobia that's happening around the world, but you also have sort of more isolated cases, more sort of culturally and environmentally specific cases, like, for example, Africans in China or like migrant workers in Singapore. So I haven't specifically seen it sort of being targeted at queer or trans people, but really that depends on the sort of predictive model that occurs, because, you know, people have been using sort of gay people and, you know, queer people as a sort of scapegoat for a lot of things. And you see that, and all it sort of takes is a bit of sort of nudging. And you kind of see that, like that case in South Korea at Itaewon, where, you know, you had the outbreaks at the sort of gay clubs and then people started pointing fingers, and, you know, it's sort of, it must be the gay people that are spreading this, or foreigners or something, you know, whatever people blame it on nowadays.
I think there's also been some understandable concerns. I've seen certainly both queer and migrant friends, people of color, being concerned about policing of this stuff, because as with any policing, it tends to mirror sort of privilege and, you know, affect certain communities more than others. I think there's been a lot of concern too, because unlike New South Wales, for example, which has released quite detailed statistics about where fines have been issued, Victoria Police continue to refuse any sort of information about where fines are being issued. But if you look at New South Wales as a sort of model, you know, you're getting lots of fines in places like Coonamble, which have a large Indigenous population, whereas the Northern Beaches have next to no fines. And this has very little correlation with where cases are actually happening. It's really sort of entrenching privilege and, you know, affecting the same communities you'd expect it to affect. So I think, again, in some ways, the pandemic just sort of exacerbates pre-existing conditions, and you get these sort of fault lines highlighted by the situation.
Yeah, and I think it's important also, like, I mean, it's not only police, but it's also security personnel, you know, which are often private companies, which are often you know, whether they're sort of, you know, guarding the institution or guarding the door at the supermarket or wherever. But, you know, there's I mean, I would definitely say since COVID started that the sort of, you know, the rubberneck, you know, checkout factor of the trans woman walking past has definitely peaked a little bit for me. I mean, I did have an incident in a public institution where I wasn't allowed to walk somewhere when there were a whole lot of people walking over there, and it was like, why me? You know, so yeah, and again, as you say, it's like that you know, it does exacerbate the pre-existing condition of which bodies are under more surveillance. So, but well, yeah, what I found interesting is that it's been private security contractors that have, for me, that have probably been more of the problem. But yeah.
We do have a question from the audience, and this is from an international student who's recently moved to Melbourne and a person of colour. It says, it was liberating to know that Melbourne is progressive, but now it's hard to start to engage with any community considering places like pubs, bars, or any kind of events are gone. I feel lonely away from supportive community here, and it also feels impossible to rely on just yourself at home. Any recommendations or suggestions?
Well, there are lots of organizations that are hosting online things as a sort of placeholder, even though it's hard to substitute an actual physical event. So you have, you know, for example, the student union, the queer department there, they've transitioned some of their events online. So you can sort of interact and engage with other queer people. There are also, you know, the drum and, you know, services like that where they have started hosting sort of QTI POC based sort of dinners or sort of virtual events. But there's always going to be something that's missing because it's not physical. And that also depends on the sort of space that you're in, because if you're in a sort of very conservative or restrictive home, you don't want people hearing, you know, things that are happening in a Zoom meeting or virtual party and that sort of thing. So it's a sort of fine line to tread when it comes to sort of things like that. But there are lots of online events, whether you're an international student, a person of color, or, you know, any combination of that.
I think another good resource that's really kind of popped up, I mean, they existed before the pandemic, but have really kind of come into their own at this point, are like mutual aid organizations and sort of neighborhood groups. For example, I'm a member of the Brunswick Good Karma Network, which sort of people post freebies and, you know, suggestions and things within the neighborhood. There are local takeaway groups as well, just letting people know. And I think, yeah, it's sort of kind of leaning into local community resources, which obviously can be very difficult when you first arrive. I know when I first moved to Melbourne, like over a decade ago, I found it quite difficult to find my people in some ways. But I think also just engaging with your classmates, for example, as a student, and sort of leading into those networks online. And just being aware, I guess, that this situation itself is temporary and that eventually we will be able to meet up with people again, be able to connect with people at the pub. So it's about sort of building those online relationships first, I guess, and then finding ways to transition that offline after this pandemic ends.
Yeah, and queer people have always used online spaces as a sort of place to meet anyways, for various reasons. So there's already exists the sort of communities and infrastructure that you have online, but it's just about, you know, having to search, and that's probably the hardest part.
I guess that leads me into this sort of next theme that I was thinking about, which is about communicating. And I was going to talk a little bit about my curated social media. I see heaps of queer communication and community building happening online. And so you mentioned Brunswick Good Karma Network, which I'm a member of also, and also, you know, queer housing, which I often refer people to if they need particular housing. But what do you think it is about queer and or trans people and their experiences that really encourages this community to share and care online? You sort of touched on it before, Oscar.
Yeah, so, well, it's just because online communities, you know, you have that sort of, you don't have to worry about physical space, geographical space, or time sort of becomes a different sort of construct there. And because you also have the elements of anonymity, people are allowed to be able to express themselves a lot easier. And because queer people have been using the internet for forever, since the internet started, to be able to network with other queer people, in addition to sort of the physical spaces, you do have all this infrastructure that already exists and a lot of communities and whatever that already exists. But it's just about understanding that sort of these virtual spaces are different from physical spaces, and sort of having different expectations of what the interactions are going to be like and what you're sort of going to get out of it.
Yeah, I think too, like, I think just out of necessity of, you know, I guess, you know, coming out and not having like family there, that we've had to kind of build our own families and our own networks and stuff, and kind of, yeah, and do them sometimes in secrecy or whatever. So I feel like that online way, you know, has always been sort of second nature to us. But I mean, you know, it's like, Oscar, you were saying I've been using the internet forever, and I guess it's like, I was born in the mid-70s, and I was just like, when I think about using the internet forever, I go like, oof, wow. I was like, I don't think I sorted out the internet until I was like well into my late 20s. So I feel like perhaps middle-aged and older queer people might actually still find this moment a little bit difficult, because I mean, I still struggle a little bit with finding connection on the internet, because I'm still, you know, still reminded of being stuck in my bedroom with books and records, you know, and I've had a bit of fun with my books and my records as well, you know, like, you know, I feel like some people are at risk of not being in that top 5 or that top 10 of people who get invited to the dinner party or to the park. And if you're not in that group of 5, or if you're not in that group of 10 and you can't assemble that group of 5 or group of 10 yourself, you know, I quite often look at it from the perspective that quite often trans feminine people can be like the 1 in 5 or the 1 in 10 in a social space. And you know, that's always been an observation that I've noticed. So yeah, it's a bit of a just a thing.
Yeah, I think in some ways we've ended up with you know, it's maybe not a fortunate situation, but, you know, out of necessity, queer people have used online spaces, often, you know, for safety. And I think about, I'm from Malaysia originally, and it's still illegal to be gay in Malaysia. There's still penalties for same-sex relations. And online spaces have been a real lifeline to a lot of queer people, because, you know, you can't necessarily access resources about coming out, about sort of sexual health, about queer identities. And so we need to kind of build our own communities to look after ourselves. And I think in some ways, the broader community has a lot to learn from queer organizing in that way, because people are now finding themselves isolated physically and spatially. And so, you know, we're having to sort of in some ways lead the way in terms of that kind of organization and in terms of that kind of community support. But as Simona noted, it's really important that we don't exclude people. I know quite a few older queer men who, yeah, do seem to be quite isolated because they don't engage with the world through the internet in the same way that millennials might do. And again, sort of how to make these spaces equitable is, you know, I guess the ongoing question.
And there is that sort of inequality as well in terms of, you know, how good your internet is. You know, whether you're from another country who doesn't have very good internet, or you're from a very rural region or remote region, or perhaps you just don't have access to certain services, like Google, for example, depending on the country you're in. So that's a sort of other inequality that you have to consider. But I'm sure that there are sort of different systems and communities in those places as well.
I find as well, you know, particularly when we think about organisations like Switchboard who do, you know, these sort of out and about program where those people who aren't perhaps the most tech savvy are able to kind of be mentored by younger people who might be able to help them with their getting out in public and doing things and going on dates and all that sort of stuff, but also with their online use as well. So I think that, you know, there's a good there's always been, I think, a legacy of mentorship in queer communities and giving each other a hand with things, you know, skill building and sharing and stuff.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the way that like community services like Switchboard or Thorn Harbour have really changed the way they connect with community. But then also like parties like Unicorns, for instance, have really changed what they're doing. Like it's, you know, like organising date, like, you know, sort of, you know, what is it? So, you know, it's like, you know, like this sort of like dating, you know, event. You know, yeah. So I mean, and there's a whole like even, you know, there's been sort of queer COVID groups that have started up as well as a way of pooling existing resources and trying to fill in the gaps, I guess. Yeah, and obviously for you know, fundraisers as well for Indigenous communities and trying to raise awareness of how this is affecting First Nations and First Nations queer people as well. So.
We have a comment here, further to what Oscar stated, is there potential for regional and remote queer community to connect now that geographical location is not a necessity? And there's also a follow-up that says many non-metropolitan people experience this all the time, this isolation. And in Australia, we also have regional areas with limited internet access. So I was curious if any of you have any experience there. Any advice?
Well, I know Thorn Harbour Country did a really exhaustive, I guess, message for Idahobit yesterday. So it would be worth looking at Thorn Harbour Country and seeing some of the regional services that exist now. Whether that's through internet or whether that's through, you know, just using the phone or whatever. I think the good thing about that organisation is that they're available on more platforms than just the internet. You know, but there's places like Mallee Pride, for instance, that are still like, they understand that they're not doing not able to do a lot of events, but they are able to offer support in that sense. Also just things like radio, just going to things like Joy FM or going to, you know, Triple R, 3CR, PBS, community radio, I still think is performing, you know, a really essential service where they've been setting up their broadcasters from home, and there's a lot of queer content on community radio that's not, you know, just something that's straight off the internet.
Yeah, without being maybe too Pollyanna-ish about it, I think in some ways the fact that there are more people on these services now and that more people are aware of these issues, I think one thing that has come out of this pandemic is seeing people talk about health and particularly mental health in a much more open way. There's been a lot more awareness of how much we need community, how much we need friendship and support. And so I think in some ways, I guess, not letting that momentum go, capitalizing on that and using those outreach sort of facilities to engage with people is the way to go.
And I also think that if you're a member of the university in a regional or rural place, you can always contact the Pride in Action Network. We're always available, you know, and reach out to us, of course. We can link you up with services or resources or community providers, whatever, you know, you're sort of looking for. I've got a question here for the architects. Is the case of hostile architecture relevant to the discussion of holding space and place for LGBTQ folks and the hate directed towards the community?
Sorry, was that the start of that question? Is the case of hostile architecture still relevant?
It is the case of hostile architecture relevant to the discussion of holding space and place for LGBTQ folks and the hate directed towards the community?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, and as I said before, I mean, I've sort of noticed that there's just been a bit of a spike, I think. I mean, particularly if you're catching things like public transport, where space is confined now, and trying to get off if you think that there's a perceived threat. I mean, public transport's always kind of like the first thing that I'd poke at in terms of like hostile urban space, because it's point of egress and point of entry is all about getting money. It's not about getting you on and off in a safe or timely fashion. It's about revenue. So I still think that remains true. I still think issues with the airport remains true. If you can afford to fly at the moment. I still think that any spaces that have surveillance at its core, but even just walking through the city, I mean, the cops have got nothing to do. And they're just looking through security cameras, waiting for something to do. I mean, that's still an issue. The street is still a space. But then Edinburgh Gardens, I went to Edinburgh Gardens on the weekend, and it was, where 10 people could hang out. And I was just like watching the police walk around, and they just sort of like, stand and watch a group, then walk off, because there was just so many people, there was nothing they could do. And then the next group of cops walked up and stood at exactly the same spot and watched a group, and then walked on. I was just like, didn't you guys like talk to each other that you'd already spent 10 minutes watching that group, and now you probably these group didn't need to do that. They could have done something else, or maybe you should have just left Edinburgh Gardens. There's no dramas, so I don't know, I still think those hostile issues are still very, very pertinent.
Yeah, I think in some ways, the way policing has been implemented during the pandemic has given the broader community a taste of what it's like to be a queer person or a non-white person, for example. Powers that are normally reserved for minority groups, things like, asking people to move on, people being excluded from spaces, these have been sort of written large, I guess, within the community for public health reasons. And so the experience has been generalized, but again, it would be these communities that face the brunt of it in terms of policing. I think, what Simona said as well about, just the kind of safety on things like public transport, Jane Jacobs' eyes on the street sort of idea where, surveillance can be a positive thing where, people watching the street helps keep it safe. In this sense, though, I think in some ways the broader community has been weaponized. So you have, people calling the cops to dob in their neighbors for having house parties and things like that. There's a bit more pressure put on it. And I think in some ways that makes things less safe for visible minorities because they're more likely to experience the brunt of these sort of actions.
Well, yeah, and we have a surveillance system that was set up for traffic, in a city as with the density that it was 3 months ago, and now we've got that same apparatus operating and the same amount of people sitting around watching it, and they're just waiting for something to happen. So when something happens, they go, "Oh, beauty! Send the car down to Elizabeth Street," and then all of a sudden you're getting escorted out of the CBD by 4 police cars.
Oscar, did you have anything to add there?
No.
No? Okay. There's a question here, Macarena, who's saying, thank you for a really interesting conversation and for sharing your experiences. Is it true that we are seeing around the world, it is true that we are seeing around the world that this pandemic is highlighting all sorts of inequalities, but class, difference in income issues are getting more attention than gender and sex inequalities? If it turns out that this situation lasts for a longer time than we would like, what strategies do you feel would help raise awareness beyond a day like yesterday?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, the issue is that these are structural problems. So it's good that there is a light being shone on it, but I think, you know, these are intersecting issues too. So experiences of homelessness and mental health problems are, you know, disproportionately borne by queer youth. And so again, just kind of having broader long-term resources for those things. I think without tackling our approaches to mental health, without tackling our approaches to housing security, these problems aren't going to go away. And so we need kind of longer term action that addresses structural issues.
It's kind of like what we were talking about last week, where, you know, you want to ensure that people are brought to the table at the beginning of discussions, no matter what that discussion is, to ensure that, you know, people are represented across class and race and gender and sexuality, you know, when we're sort of making plans to address these policies which do impact us at the end of the day. There's a question here from Lachlan that says, does the panel have any thoughts on gender expression and gender communication while physically social distancing and wearing masks, etc.? So a question about the body and about gender.
Yeah, I mean, lipstick is a really big important part of me walking in public, eh? And sometimes I have to wear lipstick to be clocked as feminine or make some attempt to pass for safety. Or because I just want to rock some hot, you know, lippy. And so that whole mood's kind of gone for a couple of different reasons there. And so usually when I take my mask off, the lippy's on the other side. But then I was at the deli one time and I took my mask off to, like, you know, order some fish, and she goes, "Oh, that's a really, really great shade of pink you've got." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you so much." So, you know, like, I feel like that whole mood's really gone, eh? You know, put the mask on and it's a choice between that and not. But yeah, sometimes it's like, I think sometimes the looks that I'm getting of what the fuck is this coming towards me is because I've got the mask on and I've got the dress on and I've got some makeup on and I've got a headband on, and everyone's just kind of like, whoa, this person's like put on an outfit. And I'm just like, nah, actually, this is just me walking up the street, thanks, you know. So that's been annoying, but I get a bit of that, and thank goodness I live, you know, sort of in a city, because I think that, you know, that might have a different impact on in other parts of the world.
There's a question here. There's actually a comment about people living rurally and regionally. It says, across the trans and gender diverse network, there have been many examples of remote TGD people using and accessing the online discussion groups, perhaps a positive for the online COVID world. There is another question. Do the panelists think that there are any specific taboos and queer issues that have been particularly difficult for queer people to deal with in lockdown? For example, living at home instead of in a share house or university accommodation. So Oscar, you kind of talked about this a little bit already. You know, if you're living with people who don't necessarily know that you're, you know, a non-normative gender or sexuality.
Yeah, so that obviously affects, you know, the way you dress, the way you act, the way you speak, but also more sort of overt things like, you know, being able to, you know, explore your sexuality and, you know, have sex and sort of things like that. I mean, it's pretty much, I mean, at least where I'm come from, you know, it's just very taboo to sort of even think about sort of sex and sort of stuff like that in a sort of casual way. When you're around family or when you're around sort of this sort of community that's based around family and sort of not friends and sort of things like that. So it's obviously the sort of issue of taboo is sort of culturally specific, and I can't speak much for what it's like here in Australia, especially since I do live alone. So it is more freeing in that sense. But I'm sure that, you know, just speak to any sort of international student who has had to go back home, and you'll find lots of sort of taboos and sort of specific queer related issues that they have to deal with during lockdown.
I guess the fact it's a health crisis as well. Things like sexual health tests are, you know, becoming a bit more difficult to do at this point in time. Without oversharing, I had my last checkup just before the clinic had to close because of the lockdown. So I think, you know, just sort of access to those sorts of services, which, you know, do need to necessarily happen in person, can be quite difficult. And so I think already, you know, when discussions about things like sexual health are taboo, just, you know, being able to do that while you're also isolated is something that needs to be addressed, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, yeah, if you're not in a queer household or something like that, but some of those taboos are definitely around sex or drugs or drinking or smoking and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, you know, if that's the sort of stuff that you've been sort of regularly engaging in at the club or someone else's house, and then all of a sudden you're sort of cold turkey off all of that stuff, like that's a, you know, that's a bit of a brick wall to face. So, you know, I guess that's sort of worth recognizing that, but also just like sort of coping with isolation as well, in that, you know, you know, everyone's going, well, you've got to go to exercise, or you've got to go to this, or you've got to go to that. It's like work and be productive, and all of a sudden our homes become these indoor gymnasiums and they become our workplace. And it's like, well, that's not really easy for everybody, you know, like considering perhaps the way that we might kind of deal with isolation, mental health, you know, not being comfortable with our sexuality or gender or anything like that, that we might take to, you know, to drugs or sex or any of these things. And it's just important that people don't feel shame around those things. But you know, I guess I just worry for people that might be in a situation where they're feeling that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think things like domestic violence, for example, that's been flagged as well as an issue, not just for the queer community, but the broader community. But yeah, the fact is lockdown has, for some people, made it quite unsafe, and home isn't always safe for all people. So again, just being able to connect the community to resources that are available for things like domestic violence is really important. So just making those things available, broadly known, and allowing people to access it when they need it.
I think it's interesting too, thinking about the specificity of a queer experience and policing and stuff. It just came to me that I live in a house with 3 other queer women, and whenever we go to the grocery store, we take, each one of us takes our license, so that to prove that we all live in the same house together, because I think we have this fear that we're not going to be believed if we get, like, you know, asked where do we live. They're not going to believe that all 4 queer women live in this house together. So that's a very, yeah, it just sort of dawned on me then. So it's interesting how much surveillance and policing is like internalized, like that fear is such an internalized kind of understanding. I do have a question. I'm just conscious of time. I think just for those people who have asked questions that I've been unable to get to, I'm going to ask the presenters, I'll just send the questions to the presenters. If there's anything that they, you know, can answer for you, we'll get them back to you, and we're going to create a list of the questions that were asked, and we'll do it all anonymously, and we can, you know, make sure that the attendees get all their questions answered. There's a lot of thank yous happening. A lot of people are thanking the panelists and really saying, like, we've opened our eyes. You know, one person saying that they're an ally with their L plates on, and the issues raised today are all things that a novice like this person hasn't really thought too much about. So they're really thankful for that. My last question is, a lot of people are also asking, what can I do? How can I make an impact on the lives of LGBTIQA people who are facing issues of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and intersex phobia? Would you have any advice for those who want to be active allies to the LGBTIQA community?
I would say if there's a charity that where the money goes directly to queer people, give to that charity or give to that fund. If it's a First Nations queer charity, if it's to do with sex workers, if it's to do with musicians, if it's to do with people of varying abilities, whatever, if there's any fund that you can donate to, do so. But also, like, put your prejudices aside. If it's something you're like, well, I wouldn't usually kind of, you know, sort of do that. I'm just kind of like, well, think that on the other end of that story is a queer person that cannot pay their rent, and that there are economies, or that there are, you know, that there are lives that we lead that, you know, that they're just gone now. And, you know, just put things aside and be an ally in that way.
I think also just, you know, being present, whether that's digitally and, you know, checking on mates, sending a message to see how people are going, but also just, you know, we're still allowed to do socially distant exercise. Ask your mates if they need, you know, some company, a walk and a cup of coffee, bring around a meal, just, you know, those sorts of things. Make sure that people aren't isolated. And I mean, that goes for any of your mates really, but particularly mates who are vulnerable for whatever reason, check in on them, make sure they're all right.
Yeah, and just checking on them, but also understand that we're all sort of going through a lot of stress right now. And, you know, don't sort of pressure people to sort of do things or expect them to reply immediately. But, you know, maybe try and invite them to sort of events, send them a short message. You know, I know AMSU Queer is doing a lot of good events right now, but don't sort of expect sort of a lot of things, and don't sort of pressure people into sort of try to sort of be productive or whatever. Everyone has their own issues right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to all the panelists, Oscar, Simona and Sun. It's been really nice to see all of your faces and hear you talk. You know, you're all my community and I'm part of yours, and it's really nice to hang out with you. I am going to sign off and say thank you. And you've got, you know, probably about 50 thank yous. My screen's just popping with thank yous. So I'll be sure to forward those through. And we're recording this session, so we're going to post it online. We'll do some editing to make it look beautiful, put in our Idahobit screen, and we'll post it online, and we'll send an email out to let everyone know that we've done that. And there's also going to just be a follow-up email with a little evaluation of how you found the session today. But I'll allow the panelists to wave goodbye. Any last minute words? Have I forgotten anything?
Thank you. Thank you.
So nice to see you, everyone.